How does a modern state begin to collapse without a single missile striking its capital? And why did Iran's crisis start not with bombs, but with silence on its roads and docks? That question began circulating among analysts in late December 2025, as footage from inside Iran revealed something unprecedented: the country's own logistics network turning inward and shutting itself down. What viewers first mistook for scattered labor protests was in reality the opening phase of a coordinated economic strangulation that no security force could easily reverse. Could a regime built around control survive once movement itself stopped? By the final week of December, Iran's economy was already under severe stress. Inflation had surged beyond sustainable levels. The rial had lost most of its purchasing power during the year, and ordinary commercial activity had slowed to a crawl. Yet the real rupture did not come from currency markets or sanctions announcements. It emerged from the arteries that carried goods, fuel, and food across the country. When cranes fell idle at ports, when trucks vanished from highways, and when factories powered down, Iran's vaunted resistance economy revealed an uncomfortable truth. It depended entirely on uninterrupted logistics. The first visible crack appeared in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. On December 28th, shop shutters closed not in protest theater, but in collective panic. Merchants no longer debated profit margins. They questioned whether goods could be replaced at all. This moment mattered because the bazaar is not merely a marketplace, it is the nerve center of Iran's internal commerce. When it froze, it sent a signal across the country that circulation had broken down. Observers at the time asked a troubling follow-up: if Tehran could not feed itself, how long before the pressure spread outward? What followed was not spontaneous chaos, but a rolling chain reaction. Within days, transport unions began coordinated stoppages. Truck drivers numbering in the millions nationwide did not march through streets or clash with police. Instead, they did something far more disruptive. They parked their vehicles and turned off their engines. Highways linking southern ports to northern cities emptied. Warehouses filled with goods that could not move. Fuel depots waited for tankers that never arrived. In strategic terms, analysts later compared this to a non-kinetic siege, one imposed not by foreign armies, but by domestic paralysis. The Iranian state attempted to downplay the scale of the stoppage, framing it as isolated labor unrest. Yet satellite imagery and verified videos told a different story. Major arteries leading into Tehran showed kilometers of empty asphalt. Food supply chains, which rely on daily replenishment, began to fracture. Bakeries reported flour shortages. Supermarkets quietly limited sales. At this stage, the crisis was still reversible, at least on paper. But the regime faced a structural problem. Logistics cannot be compelled at gunpoint. A soldier can guard a road, but cannot force a driver to move freight efficiently across thousands of kilometers. Western economic analysts began to warn that Iran was entering a classic supply-side shock, the most dangerous form of economic disruption. Unlike demand collapses, supply shocks cannot be fixed by printing money or issuing subsidies. When goods stop moving, inflation accelerates even faster. Reuters and other outlets noted that Iran's food inflation was already approaching extreme thresholds by early January 2026. The question shifted from whether shortages would appear to how quickly they would compound into systemic breakdown. Meanwhile, beyond Iran's borders, policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and NATO headquarters watched closely. With Donald Trump back in the White House, U.S. strategy emphasized economic pressure over military escalation. The emerging crisis inside Iran appeared to validate a long-held Western assessment: internal fragility posed a greater threat to the regime than external attack. Yet even seasoned analysts underestimated how fast logistics failure could cascade. As trucks remained idle and markets stayed closed, another realization began to surface. This was only the opening act. What followed next, unfolding far from Tehran's shopfronts and highways, would strike at the regime's connection to the outside world itself. If the shutdown of markets signaled economic distress, the empty highways soon confirmed something far more serious. Iran was being cut into isolated islands by its own transport network. Why did a nation that prided itself on resilience suddenly find its roads transformed into barriers rather than lifelines? That question dominated regional briefings in early January 2026 as evidence mounted that the trucker stoppage had evolved into a nationwide chokehold. Unlike previous labor disputes, this action followed a strikingly disciplined pattern. Drivers did not block roads chaotically or clash with security forces in dramatic confrontations. Instead, they positioned their vehicles strategically, parking them along critical junctions and supply corridors, linking the south to the capital. By doing nothing, they achieved what decades of sanctions had failed to do. They immobilized the flow of goods inside a country of nearly 90 million people. Analysts described it as logistics denial, a tactic more commonly associated with modern warfare than domestic unrest. Footage verified by international outlets showed highways around Shiraz, Isfahan, and Qom eerily quiet. Long-haul trucks, normally the backbone of Iran's internal economy, were absent. This was not merely symbolic. Iran's food system operates on tight margins, relying on daily deliveries from agricultural regions and imports unloaded at southern ports. When trucks stopped, inventories began shrinking within days. Tehran, a megacity of over 15 million residents, felt the pressure almost immediately. Government officials attempted to reassure the public, claiming that emergency stocks were sufficient. Yet reports from wholesalers suggested otherwise. Flour shipments slowed. Fuel deliveries became erratic. Even hospitals quietly raised concerns about medical supply continuity. Military logistics units were deployed to move essential goods, but experts quickly noted the mathematical impossibility of replacing civilian transport at scale. Armies move supplies efficiently in combat zones, not across entire national economies. From a strategic perspective, Western analysts saw familiar warning signs. During previous crises in Lebanon and Venezuela, similar transport breakdowns had triggered rapid inflation spikes and social instability. Reuters' economic correspondents pointed out that Iran's inflation rate, already exceeding 70%, was especially vulnerable to supply disruption. Every idle truck translated into higher prices not because demand increased, but because scarcity intensified. This moment also exposed a deeper vulnerability. Logistics workers occupy a uniquely powerful position in any modern economy. Unlike industrial laborers tied to fixed sites, truck drivers control movement itself. By withdrawing cooperation, they effectively imposed a civilian blockade. Security forces faced a dilemma. Cracking down risked violent escalation and international scrutiny. Ignoring the stoppage allowed shortages to deepen. Either option weakened the state's authority. Meanwhile, the psychological impact grew. The absence of trucks became a visible symbol of paralysis. Citizens traveling between cities reported long stretches of road without commercial traffic, reinforcing the perception that something fundamental had broken. Economists noted that perception matters almost as much as material shortage. Once businesses believe resupply is uncertain, hoarding behavior accelerates collapse. NATO planners and U.S. officials quietly assessed the implications. With Donald Trump emphasizing pressure campaigns and deterrence over direct intervention, the unfolding crisis inside Iran aligned with broader Western objectives without requiring military involvement. Yet the unpredictability of such internal collapse raised new concerns. Would the regime attempt to redirect the crisis outward, or would internal fractures deepen first? As highways remained silent and cities grew increasingly dependent on dwindling reserves, attention began shifting to another pressure point, one that connected Iran not just internally, but to the global economy. What followed next shocked analysts even more than the empty roads, because it demonstrated that paralysis had reached Iran's gateways to the world. If highways revealed paralysis in motion, factories soon exposed paralysis in production, and analysts began asking a sharper question: what happens when a state can neither move goods nor make them? By mid-January 2026, that question moved from theory to reality, as Iran's industrial centers fell silent. Unlike earlier labor disputes confined to wages or fuel prices, this wave cut directly into the regime's productive core. The first alarms came from Isfahan, a city whose importance extends far beyond its cultural symbolism. It is one of Iran's primary industrial and military hubs, hosting steel mills, petrochemical facilities, and defense-linked manufacturing sites. When workers there began coordinated stoppages, the effects rippled almost immediately. Steel output slowed to a trickle. Downstream manufacturers reported missing inputs within days. Analysts noted that this was not a temporary disruption. It was a structural shock to the entire supply chain. What made the situation uniquely dangerous for the regime was the nature of modern industrial labor. Production lines cannot simply be restarted by force. Even as security units were deployed to industrial zones, they faced a fundamental limitation: trained workers cannot be replaced overnight. Western defense analysts interviewed by outlets such as Defense News emphasized that advanced manufacturing, from automotive components to precision machinery, requires specialized skills. A soldier can occupy a factory floor, but cannot operate CNC machines or recalibrate assembly systems under pressure. The crisis deepened when it spread north to Tabriz, one of Iran's largest industrial cities and a key node in its automotive and machinery sectors. Reports indicated that hundreds of thousands of workers joined the stoppages there, effectively freezing production lines across multiple industries. This had immediate consequences. Parts shortages cascaded through the economy. Vehicles could not be assembled. Household appliances stalled mid-production. Agricultural equipment repairs were delayed at the height of winter demand. Economists recognized a classic supply shock, unfolding one far more destabilizing than consumer-driven downturns. When factories stop producing, inflation accelerates not because money is scarce, but because goods vanish. Reuters' analysis warned that Iran was approaching a feedback loop. Shortages drove prices higher. Higher prices fueled unrest, and unrest further reduced output. This cycle, once established, is notoriously difficult to break. The regime attempted countermeasures. Emergency decrees pressured state-linked factories to resume operations. Revolutionary Guard units were stationed at select sites. Yet these moves produced diminishing returns. Without voluntary labor participation, output remained negligible. Worse, visible militarization of workplaces reinforced the perception that the state had lost its grip on economic normalcy. From a strategic Western perspective, the implications were significant. NATO economic analysts had long argued that Iran's resilience depended on its ability to sustain domestic production under sanctions. The unfolding events challenged that assumption. With Donald Trump back in office and U.S. policy emphasizing economic containment, the internal collapse of Iranian industry appeared to magnify external pressure without additional sanctions being imposed. Yet another dimension troubled observers. Industrial shutdowns threatened not only civilian markets, but also defense supply chains. Military Watch magazine noted that disruptions in steel and machinery sectors could indirectly affect weapons maintenance and domestic arms production. Even a temporary interruption risked long-term degradation of readiness, a vulnerability closely monitored by regional rivals. As factories stayed dark and warehouses emptied, it became clear that Iran's crisis had moved beyond transport and into the realm of systemic economic failure. Still, one critical question remained unanswered. How long could Iran remain connected to global trade if its internal production was collapsing? The answer began to emerge at the country's most vital maritime gateway, where the next phase of paralysis would prove even more devastating. When analysts turned their attention from factories to ports, a far more alarming question surfaced. What happens when a country loses the ability to breathe economically? By late January 2026, that question was no longer hypothetical. Iran's maritime gateway at Bandar Abbas, responsible for the overwhelming majority of non-oil trade, had fallen into near-total paralysis. What began as a labor stoppage quickly evolved into something far more consequential, a functional severing of Iran from global commerce. Bandar Abbas is not simply a port, it is the logistical lung of the Iranian state. Food imports, medical supplies, industrial components, and export goods all pass through its docks. When crane operators, dock workers, and port logistics crews withdrew their labor, the effect was immediate and absolute. Ships waited offshore for days, then weeks unable to unload. Containers stacked up in holding areas with no mechanism to move them inland. For an economy already strained by transport and industrial shutdowns, this represented a catastrophic escalation. Reports circulating in Western media described scenes rarely seen outside wartime blockades. Cargo vessels remained anchored in the Persian Gulf, their contents effectively frozen. Perishable goods began to spoil. Importers warned of imminent shortages, not just of luxury items, but of basic staples. Even state-controlled media struggled to mask the severity of the disruption, as images leaked showing idle cranes silhouetted against empty docks. From an economic standpoint, the consequences were devastating. Bandar Abbas handles the majority of Iran's non-oil exports and a substantial portion of its imports. With throughput collapsing, foreign trade revenues fell sharply. Reuters analysts noted that trade interruptions at this scale typically reduce GDP not in quarters, but in days. Each idle vessel represented millions of dollars in delayed or lost transactions, compounding Iran's already fragile balance of payments. The regime's response exposed its limitations. Security forces were deployed to secure port facilities, and emergency regulations attempted to compel workers back on site. Yet, as with factories and highways, coercion failed to restore functionality. A port does not operate on force alone. Without skilled operators, cranes do not move. Without coordinated crews, cargo does not flow. Western logistics experts pointed out that modern ports are among the most labor-sensitive infrastructures in any economy. Even partial withdrawal of cooperation can halt operations entirely. Strategically, the shutdown carried implications far beyond Iran's borders. NATO maritime analysts flagged the development as a rare case of internal labor action achieving effects, comparable to a naval blockade without a single foreign warship involved. For the United States under President Donald Trump, the situation reinforced a core strategic assessment. Iran's vulnerabilities lay less in military confrontation and more in systemic economic fragility. International partners began to reassess risk exposure. Insurance premiums for shipping near Iranian ports rose sharply. Foreign traders hesitated to send cargo to a port that could not guarantee unloading or inland transport. This reputational damage mattered. Once a port is seen as unreliable, restoring confidence can take years even after operations resume. Meanwhile, shortages inside Iran intensified. Goods trapped at sea could not reach cities already suffering from transport stoppages. The sense of isolation deepened. Analysts warned that port paralysis often marks a point of no return in economic crises because it chokes off the external inputs needed for recovery. Yet even as Iran's gateways to the world closed, another lifeline was coming under pressure, one that sustained not just the economy, but the regime's political survival itself. What followed next shocked analysts because it struck directly at the state's primary source of hard currency and power projection. If ports represented Iran's lungs, oil was its bloodstream, and by early February 2026, that bloodstream was slowing to a dangerous trickle. Analysts began asking an unavoidable question: how long can a state survive when its primary source of cash flow is deliberately shut off from within? The answer increasingly appeared to be measured in weeks rather than months. Iran's energy sector has always been more than an economic engine. It finances state salaries, security forces, and regional influence operations stretching from the Levant to the Gulf. When refinery and oil field workers in Khuzestan and around Bandar Abbas joined the broader stoppages, the impact dwarfed earlier disruptions. This was no symbolic slowdown. Workers closed valves, halted refining processes, and reduced output on a scale rarely seen outside wartime attacks. By mid-January, credible estimates circulating among Western energy analysts suggested that oil production had fallen by roughly 40%. For a country dependent on hydrocarbon exports for foreign currency, the losses were staggering. Daily revenue shortfalls were measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Tankers loaded with crude waited offshore, unable to dock or complete transactions as port operations remained frozen. Oil that could not move could not be sold, and oil that could not be sold could not sustain the state. Reuters energy correspondents noted that Iran was facing a dual shock: production losses at home and collapsing export logistics abroad. Even buyers willing to risk sanctions hesitated, wary of delivery delays and contractual uncertainty. This compounded an already fragile financial position. With inflation soaring and reserves under strain, the regime's fiscal options narrowed dramatically. The strategic implications extended beyond Iran. Energy markets, already sensitive due to ongoing conflict in Eastern Europe and repeated Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure reported by BBC and Defense News, reacted nervously. Analysts drew parallels between Iran's internal shutdown and Ukraine's campaign against Russian refineries, noting a shared lesson. Modern states are acutely vulnerable when energy flows are disrupted, whether by drones or domestic labor action. For Washington and its NATO allies, the situation underscored the effectiveness of indirect pressure. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. policy emphasized economic leverage and deterrence rather than direct confrontation. The collapse of Iran's oil revenues without a single Western strike fit squarely within that strategic framework. Yet it also raised concerns about instability spilling across the region, particularly if the regime sought external distractions to offset internal weakness. Inside Iran, the social consequences intensified. Fuel shortages rippled into transportation, agriculture, and electricity generation. Power outages became more frequent. Inflation surged further as energy costs fed into every sector of the economy. Economists warned that the country was approaching a hyperinflationary threshold, where confidence in the currency could collapse entirely. The regime attempted damage control, promising wage adjustments and threatening severe penalties for economic sabotage. But credibility was thin. Without oil revenue, even security forces faced delayed payments. Observers noted that regimes rarely survive prolonged periods in which they cannot reliably pay those tasked with enforcing order. Meanwhile, the external picture darkened. As oil income dried up, Iran's relationships with major partners began to fray under the weight of simple arithmetic. Without reliable exports, alliances built on energy and trade lost their foundation. What followed next stunned many analysts because it revealed that Iran's crisis was no longer contained within its borders. It was reshaping regional and global calculations in real time. By the time Iran's oil revenues faltered, the final question confronting analysts was no longer whether the crisis was systemic, but how far its consequences would extend beyond Iran's borders. What followed next shocked observers because it exposed the fragility of Tehran's external partnerships at the very moment the regime needed them most. Trade data emerging in late January and early February 2026 revealed a sharp contraction in Iran's economic ties with its two most important non-Western partners, China and Russia. Beijing's reaction was swift and pragmatic. According to figures cited by international trade analysts and echoed in Reuters reporting, bilateral trade volumes fell by roughly a quarter within weeks. The explanation was not ideological, but logistical. With ports paralyzed and inland transport unreliable, Chinese exporters could not deliver goods, and Chinese refiners could not count on consistent Iranian oil shipments. For Beijing, energy security outweighs political symbolism. As a result, alternative suppliers were quietly prioritized, signaling a downgrade of Iran from strategic partner to operational liability. The Russian dimension proved equally revealing. Moscow had long viewed Iran as a critical node in the international north-south transport corridor, a route designed to bypass Western sanctions amid the war in Ukraine. Yet rail stoppages, port paralysis, and industrial shutdowns inside Iran rendered the corridor effectively unusable. Trade volumes with Russia dropped sharply, undermining plans to move grain machinery and military-related goods through Iranian territory. Analysts noted the irony: a regime that had positioned itself as a sanctions-proof hub was now incapacitated by its own internal breakdown. For NATO planners and U.S. policymakers, these developments carried strategic weight. Under President Donald Trump, Washington's approach emphasized economic containment and alliance leverage rather than direct intervention. Iran's unraveling demonstrated how internal fragility could amplify external pressure without escalating into open conflict. At the same time, Western officials remained cautious. History suggests that regimes facing internal collapse often attempt external diversion, raising the risk of regional escalation. Inside Iran, the political response turned increasingly desperate. Reports from human rights organizations and international media described intensified repression, mass arrests, and expanded internet blackouts. Yet even these measures failed to restore economic circulation. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. Economists warned that the longer logistics production and trade remained stalled, the harder recovery would become even under a future political settlement. As winter wore on, one reality became unavoidable. Iran's crisis was no longer a temporary shock, but a structural collapse in motion. The convergence of transport stoppages, industrial paralysis, port shutdowns, and energy disruption had stripped the regime of its core sources of legitimacy and revenue. Whether this moment would lead to reform, fragmentation, or prolonged instability remained uncertain. Yet one final question lingered for observers worldwide. If a modern state can be undone by silence, empty roads, idle cranes, closed valves, what does that imply for other economies under pressure? And as these events continue to unfold, is the international community prepared for the consequences of a prolonged Iranian breakdown?